Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle for PC, Xbox Series X and S, and eventually PlayStation 5, but it's not currently out yet as I'm making this video. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version. This is an action-adventure game developed by Machine Games and published by Bethesda Softworks on December 9th of last year for PC and Xbox Series X and S, which depending on when you're watching this video might sound like quite a while ago, but as I'm recording it, it was only a few weeks ago because I'm making this video in January of 2025. And the response to the game has been fairly interesting over the past several weeks because when the game first launched, its reception was very positive across the board. You would see YouTubers and such saying that it was great, you would see the various game publication sites saying it was great, and if you wanted to lose some brain cells, you could look at what the so-called immersive sim fan base was saying and acting like it was the best thing since sliced bread. And then after the first, say, 4 or 5 days of release, suddenly all of that hype just abruptly ends and the game is effectively forgotten. And I can't help but wonder why. Is it just the way that our modern media cycle is, to where everybody has the attention span of a goldfish? Or is it because the game itself is actually not all that great and isn't actually worth all of the hype that was generated around it in those initial few days? Well, thanks to actually being able to mess around with this thing on Game Pass instead of having to pay the full $70 US asking price for it, I decided to delve into this thing and find out what exactly is going on with this thing and whether or not it is actually a so-called sleeper hit or whatever of 2024, or whether it's just a flash in the pan. And immediately I started running into some odd things with it that I can't help but mention because they're very amusing to me. The first came up before I even started the game up, and that was after it finished installing through the Microsoft Store and Game Pass and all that. I went looking for my start menu entry to be able to play it, and I couldn't find it. So I was wondering what the hell happened there, and I was just scrolling through my entire start menu until eventually I got to the very bottom of it, and found it because it's in Japanese. I don't know why it's in Japanese. The game itself isn't in Japanese. When you boot it up, it shows the Japanese text for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle on the title bar of the splash screen, and it says it in the start menu entry, but the actual game itself is just the North American version in English. So I have no idea what's going on there, but I was actually concerned jumping into this thing that the entire thing would be in Japanese, and thankfully I found out that it's not. So that mild crisis was averted almost immediately, thankfully. And then I actually get into the game proper and I start messing around with the graphics settings and the control options, and immediately I start finding weird things, like the leaning controls being bound to Z and C. Or Z for those of you across the pond. And I was just utterly baffled by this. Now, obviously I could go on a tirade about controls, but the controls actually aren't a problem. It's just the default binding is really weird. I don't know why they thought Z and C were appropriate for leaning, considering that Q and E have been the default leaning controls for almost 30 years now. And in fact, I can only think of one other game off the top of my head that has tried to make Z and C the default leaning keys, at least in my recollection anyway. There may be other ones out there that have tried to do it. And that is Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl. Even though Shadow of Chernobyl, Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat had Q and E being the default leaning controls. I don't know why developers are suddenly trying to make Z and C leaning controls. It makes no sense to me. It's less intuitive than using Q and E because you actually have to adjust your grip to do Z and C, so that actually briefly interferes with your ability to strafe left and right, thus meaning that it's getting in the way of you actually playing the game properly. Whereas you don't have to do that with Q and E, you can just shift your fingers themselves so that you're still holding either left or right, but then you actually press Q or E on top of that. I just don't understand the thought process here, because normally when I have to rebind keys, I'll have to rebind E from the use key into something else, because a lot of games these days try to make E the use key, and I prefer it as F. And I'll have to rebind crouch from C to control, because that's what I normally use as the crouch button. And that's not what I had to do here, so it was definitely an odd experience booting this game up and getting into it. I was already just confused out of the gate and wondering what the hell they were thinking with that. And it initially had me really concerned that because this game was built primarily around Xbox and thus gamepad controls, that actually playing it on keyboard and mouse would be miserable. And, well, we'll get to that more when I get to the gameplay. But thankfully I was at least able to fix the leaning controls being weird by just rebinding them to Q and E like I would expect them to be. But then things got weird when I actually started playing the game and tried to lean, so we'll get there. At any rate, I do want to mention that I'm not really sure whether the controls are rebindable on console or not. Someone in the comments might be able to answer that. But I do know that there's not an FOV adjustment option on the console version, at least not yet as far as I know. I know there wasn't one on launch. There is a FOV adjustment option on PC, which is good because it is considerably more important to adjust your FOV on PC. You're sitting a lot closer to the monitor. You need a wider FOV in order to avoid motion sickness compared to someone who's, say, playing on a console and the TV is basically across the room from where they're sitting, so a lower FOV doesn't affect them quite as much. It still would be a nice option for console players to have if they could bump up that FOV, so hopefully they do implement that if they haven't already. At any rate, that covers a few of the oddities that I wanted to mention, so let's just start delving into this thing and see what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether or not it lives up to the hype that was generated over the first few days of its release, or whether there's something more to that sudden drop-off of hype after the first few days. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation. Now this runs on a modification of id Tech 7, which was the engine that powered Doom Eternal, and Machine Games have taken to calling it Motor powered by id Tech. This is only the second game released to use this iteration of the id Tech engine, and generally speaking, Machine Games have done a quite good job of making the game look pretty good and also run quite well. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary depending on what your hardware is, but for the sake of comparison, I'm running a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model. And at 1080p, it is well over 60 frames per second at nearly all times. Sometimes it does dip down into the 60s themselves, but I can't remember a single instance where it dipped below that. And depending on the environment, sometimes it would even get up well over 100 frames a second, which was always nice to see. That said, it does have a few issues. While the modeling, texture quality, and generally speaking animations are all quite good, there are some oddities here and there. Things like facial expressions and lip syncing not being quite as good as you would hope from a AAA title like this, as well as, of course, the odd visual glitch here and there. But one thing that is going to be a source of contention for a lot of people is basically the reason why this game's system requirements are so high, why it demands at minimum an RTX card rather than a GTX card. And that is because there is absolutely no way of running this game without ray tracing enabled. You can have it to a low setting, but you cannot disable it entirely, and you also cannot disable upscaling entirely. At bare minimum, you have to have native TAA, temporal anti-aliasing, enabled. TAA has rapidly risen to become the standard form of anti-aliasing industry-wide, at the least in the AAA space anyway. And while this wouldn't necessarily be as much of a problem if it were an optional thing where you could just disable TAA entirely and run the game without any anti-aliasing, or you had a selection of other anti-aliasing techniques you could use, increasingly the AAA space in particular is forcing it upon players, and most people don't really like TAA because it causes the image to get quite blurry and introduces a lot of ghosting, meaning that it looks like the image is being more smeared or dragged across your screen rather than actually rendered in motion like it should. Not only that, but any anti-aliasing technique, no matter what it is going to reduce overall performance, and if you are forcing TAA on players, that means that performance is going to be compromised right out of the box rather than the player choosing to enable an anti-aliasing technique and choosing to take that performance hit. And as you might expect, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle does suffer a bit from having TAA forced on the player. Since you have no way of turning it off, you just have to put up with the image being a bit blurry no matter where you are and what you're doing, and when inevitably the image starts ghosting, you're just going to have to put up with it because there's no way of getting rid of it. But as annoying as the TAA is, I think the most annoying issue in terms of visuals in this game is the lip sync. It varies wildly from moment to moment. When you're in regular gameplay, it tends to not be good, but even during cutscenes, it often just completely craps out on itself and doesn't remotely match what the characters are actually saying. I should also note that whenever the game goes into a cutscene, it locks the frame rate at 60, so moment-to-moment gameplay can go all the way up to the hundreds of FPS, but then you get into a cutscene and immediately you're locked at 60 FPS no matter what it was running at before. The end result of all of this is that while the game generally looks pretty good as far as, again, modeling, texture quality, and general animations are concerned, and the environments in particular are downright gorgeous at times, the moment-to-moment experience can be awfully jarring, going from high frame rate to locked at 60, to having blurriness and image ghosting problems from the forced TAA, or the lip syncing just completely crapping out of itself and just making it look like the characters are doing lip flaps from, frankly at this point, over 20 years ago in terms of how much it doesn't match up with what they're saying. And that's even ignoring the visual glitches and just general jank that this game tends to suffer from in actual gameplay. But of course I'll get to that more when I talk about the gameplay itself. That's not to say that all of the visuals are a complete loss, however. There are some nice touches here and there, like the journal that gradually fills out as you play through the game, whereas you complete main missions and side missions, as well as just find notes and take photographs and such like that, your journal will actually start filling up with those things, and it will chronicle your entire adventure. Or how they tried to make the interface somewhat diegetic instead of just being an abstract interface. So when you open up your inventory, Indy whips out his satchel. Whenever you use a bandage to heal yourself, Indy actually applies the bandage. Whenever you eat food, he actually brings the food up to his mouth and takes a bite out of it. And whenever you start picking up items in the world, he actually reaches out and grabs it and brings it up to take a look at it or just holds it in his hand. And don't get me wrong, those are all nice touches that help to add to immersion, and thankfully they made them all quick and expedient enough to where it doesn't really interrupt your playing of the game, so it doesn't really get annoying. But frankly, they should have focused on fixing up some of those issues that I just mentioned, rather than putting in these more diegetic or immersive elements that don't really add much to the experience overall. On the other hand, while the visuals certainly have some issues, generally speaking the sound design is quite solid in this game. The soundtrack sounds exactly like you would expect from an Indiana Jones piece of media, with that kind of classic adventure movie orchestral feel. And the sound effects are all quite solid across the board, whether you're just beating the living crap out of your opponents with your fists or whatever melee weapon you've scrounged up, or you're even outright blasting them with rifles or pistols or whatever. The combat sounds are actually quite good. That's one thing that was always kind of fun about the classic Indiana Jones movies. Whenever somebody threw a punch and belted someone upside the head, it sounded impactful, and they have carried that forward into the game as well. And the same kind of thing goes for whenever the whip is deployed. It always has that really nice satisfying whip crack sound effect. Or whenever you start picking up melee weapons and bashing enemies upside the head with them, they always have a nice meaty thunk to them as well. And then of course there's the gunfire and explosion sounds. Now, there's not very many opportunities to use any kind of explosives in the game. You're mostly going to be using TNT bundles that you might find in certain areas, and while the explosion sound effect for the TNT isn't necessarily awful, it doesn't have quite the nice thunderous bassy boom that you might hope for. The gunfire, on the other hand, is quite decent across the board. The revolver, shotgun, and rifles in particular sound fairly beefy, while the other weapons, which are weaker than those, don't have quite the same amount of punch to the sound effects, but that's to be expected. There is, however, a bit of a disconnect between the sounds of the weapons and the explosions and the actual effect on target they have, both in terms of visuals and in gameplay. I'll talk about the gameplay later, but in terms of visuals, you don't really get a whole lot of indication that when you shoot an enemy, it's actually doing a lot of damage. Sure, they will react to it somewhat, but of course, in order to get the T rating from the ESRB, they had to severely tone down the blood and gore in this game, so while there is some blood in the game, it's barely noticeable, and that does detract from the overall combat experience. It makes the combat less viscerally satisfying. It's not necessarily a huge problem in isolation, but it's something that I'll come back to when we talk about the gameplay, so just bear with me a moment here. And then, of course, after all of that, there is the elephant in the room, which is the voice acting. More specifically, Indy is not voiced by Harrison Ford, which is nothing new for Indiana Jones video games. Seriously, go back and look at any of the previous Indiana Jones video games, whether it's Fate of Atlantis, Infernal Machine, Emperor's Tomb, or even Staff of Kings, and you will see that Harrison Ford did not provide the voice for Indiana Jones in any of them. They were all voiced by different people, except in the cases of Fate of Atlantis and Infernal Machine, where they both had the same voice actor for those games, but they never repeated that with any of the other ones. Now we come to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and they have chosen Troy Baker to do the voice of Indiana Jones, and this did not sit right with a lot of people out there. And I think a lot of that is because Troy seems like he's in damn near everything these days, and it always seems like he has more or less the same voice for every game he's in, but I have to admit, he did a really good impression of Harrison Ford in this game. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but he does a very good Indiana Jones voice that is arguably the closest the character has ever sounded to the original actor in terms of video games. This does, however, come at a bit of a cost. As good as Troy Baker's imitation of Harrison Ford is, it does sometimes sound just like someone is trying to do an impression of Indiana Jones rather than actually embodying the character. I know that probably sounds a bit pretentious, but what I'm trying to say here is that rather than it sounding like the character himself is saying lines and the delivery actually feeling like it's a natural delivery, sometimes it just ends up sounding like someone is trying to do an Indiana Jones impression and the delivery ends up being a bit stiff. And to be fair, this has always been a problem whenever you are dealing with a situation where the character is from, say, a movie or TV series and they are not being voiced by the actor who originally played that character. So it's not necessarily a big problem, but it is something that you will notice every so often, and it does take you out of the experience just a bit. And that is a bit more of a problem in this game compared to a lot of other games out there that may be trying to accomplish the same things mechanically and narratively, but aren't necessarily based on source material like a movie or TV show. You see, a lot of what makes a game based on a licensed property like this really work is nailing the vibe of the original material. And voice acting is one of the areas where that tends to break down in video games. Thankfully, most of the cast in this particular game is original to this game, so apart from the intro sequence of the game, which is just a retelling of the opening sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark, as well as, of course, just Indy himself throughout the entire game, and a couple of sections where Marcus Brody is present, you don't have that kind of baggage associated with characters from the original movies or even the TV series, because there was actually a TV series in case you didn't know that. And so the actors who were playing those roles just had to make sure that they were nailing those specific roles. They didn't need to worry about imitating the work of someone else. And again, as good of a job as Troy Baker does, you can tell the difference between his performance and everyone else's performance in terms of how comfortable they were doing it. Now, of course, it's not a deal breaker. The voice cast generally does a very good job with their performances. It's just that some of the lines they have them say here and there are, shall we say, questionable at best. Although I will hold off on explaining more of that until I talk more about the story and the way the characters are written. Suffice it to say, however, the voice cast in general does a very good job, and when you bring all of the presentation together, they've more or less nailed the feel of an Indiana Jones game. They do a very good job of making the game feel like the movies in terms of just the general vibe from how everything is presented. But here's the thing, while presentation counts for quite a lot when it comes to making a game based on some other property work, at the end of the day, it all comes down to the story and gameplay to determine whether or not the game itself is actually worth playing. Now, the story in this is set in 1937, putting it squarely between Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is set in 1936, and The Last Crusade, which is set in 1938, and it starts with a flashback sequence to the opening scenes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indy is in the jungles of Peru. And after this flashback sequence concludes, Indy wakes up and reveals that that was just a dream he was having after a long night of drinking with Marcus at Marshall College, the place where they both work, and Indy realizes that someone is out and causing mischief in the college, so he decides to investigate and finds out that someone has actually broken into the college, and it turns out to be a very large man who you later find out is named Locus, and he is played by the unfortunately late Tony Todd. It was the last role that he played before he unfortunately passed away last year. And when Indy confronts Locus, it doesn't go well. Locus ends up knocking him out, and the following day, Indy wakes up with Marcus worrying over him, and after they get up and investigate the damage and find out what was stolen, it turns out that it was an artifact that is referred to as a cat mummy. It's just a sculpture of a cat mummy, and not only does Indy refuse to let the theft go unanswered, but he just has to know why this specific cat mummy was stolen, and more importantly, what the Vatican has to do with it, because they find out that the Vatican is somehow involved here. So he travels to the Vatican, and after a good deal of searching, finds out that there is something called the Nephilim Order, which is a group of giants who have been secretly working with the Catholic Church to protect artifacts and knowledge related to something called the Great Circle, where there are a series of important locations scattered around the globe that when you draw a line between them, it creates a perfect circle. And with this being an Indiana Jones game set in the 30s, obviously the Nazis are interested in whatever the secret of the Great Circle is, and spearheading their efforts to find the secrets of the Great Circle is archaeologist Emmerich Voss, who is the main antagonist throughout the entire game. And while he seems to hit all of the right notes for a stereotypical Nazi villain with a massive inferiority complex, always seeming to be able to say and do the right things to weasel his way out of any kind of consequences for his own actions, and does a very good job of being overbearing and annoying enough to where the player is obviously going to want to see him fall. Unfortunately, he is lacking the one thing that would make him a truly good antagonist, which is being threatening. I mean, sure, he's in command of a bunch of Nazi thugs, and whenever he's operating in areas that are controlled by the Italians, he has access to their forces as well. But at the end of the day, he's just an obnoxious nerd with an inferiority complex who happens to be in a position of power. The writers seem to think they've positioned Emmerich Voss as some sort of dark mirror image of Indy, as if he is what Indy would be were Indy not concerned with ethics or morality of any kind, and it just doesn't really work. This is because of a few things. The first of them is that all of the antagonists, not just Voss himself, but every single one of them, are really more caricatures than actual characters. Now, to some degree, this is in keeping with the rest of the Indiana Jones franchise. Whenever the Nazis are portrayed, they are portrayed as nothing really more than thugs and brutes who are obsessed with power at any cost. But in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, there is an air of incompetent buffoonery about the whole mess. As if rather than the Nazis, and especially the Italian fascists in the game, being a real force of evil in the world that is a true threat to everything we hold dear, they're actually all just a bunch of bumbling idiots. And this is where modern-day politics are going to rear their ugly head. I really wish I didn't have to discuss how modern politics have actually affected the writing in this game, but I have no choice because it actually negatively affects the game. You see, the main way that modern politics influence video games is in what are referred to as DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we'll talk about that more a bit later. But Indiana Jones and the Great Circle suffers from another problem in modern politics that is more insidious as far as I'm concerned. You see, over the past roughly decade or so, there has been an increasingly dramatic trend of the political left wing, particularly in the US, but even in Europe and Canada as well, to describe basically anyone and anything they even slightly disagree with as Nazi and or fascist. And these same circles who continue to horrendously misuse both terms also tend to push the idea that they are truly enlightened, highly educated individuals, and everyone else is just a bumbling, incompetent moron. And you can see where I'm going with this. Those of you who are familiar with Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus will be absolutely no strangers to how left-leaning the staff at Machine Games can be, and while thankfully they showed at least some level of restraint when writing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, it still tends to bleed through every so often, particularly in how the antagonists are portrayed mainly as just bumbling idiots rather than a true force of evil that Indy must vanquish. So you end up in that really weird situation where cognitively you know that the Nazis and the fascists are the bad guys and they must be defeated, but because of the way they're portrayed, they just don't feel like much of a threat at all. And the gameplay mechanics do pretty much everything possible to reinforce that idea, but we'll get there in a moment, don't worry. So this cheapening of the antagonists is the worst way that modern politics influence it. But the other main way that modern politics have influenced this game is in the form of what used to be called DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion, and have since been rebranded numerous times with numerous different terms in an attempt to avoid scrutiny as much as they can. Now, I really don't want to get into some sort of political diatribe here, but the long and short of what DEI programs and initiatives are attempting to achieve ends up being tokenism at absolute best, and at worst it is outright institutionalized discrimination. Now, thankfully, the way this manifests in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is mostly on the mild side of things. So you have things like Pai Lin, the leader of the Siam rebel group that's going up against the Italian fascists, only having one eye, and it having absolutely no effect on her ability to do anything at all. Same kind of thing with Father Antonio and his hearing aids. Clearly he has suffered hearing loss, but it doesn't actually seem to affect him in any meaningful way. I mean, he listens to music, he can hold conversations just fine. Even when he doesn't have his hearing aids in, he seems to be able to pick up on things just fine, like his disability is more of a mild inconvenience than anything else. Now, I'm not saying they need to be constantly calling attention to these things, because frankly that would make it a lot more obnoxious, but when you're going to implement things like disabilities on characters, it needs to actually affect them in a meaningful way. Otherwise, there's no point to them having a disability. It's just there to tick a checkbox of, hey, look, we're more diverse because we have these characters with disabilities. I mean, as an example, vision loss or outright losing an eye will affect your depth perception. You'll have a harder time being able to tell when things are coming at you and how close they are in relation to you than someone with two eyes. You'll have a harder time judging distances. And obviously your peripheral vision will be dramatically affected. You will just lose an entire section of your peripheral vision and not be able to see anything in that space. Absolutely none of these things are insignificant, and more importantly, those are all hard enough to deal with in your day-to-day life just as a regular civilian. Pai Lin is not a civilian. She is an active combatant leading a group of rebels against the Italians. And despite having clearly lost an eye and wearing a very elaborate eye patch that is very attention-grabbing, I have to say, it doesn't affect her in any noticeable way. It's all just handled in a very reductive, superficial manner, and it just comes across as not only incredibly disingenuous, but downright insulting to the player's intelligence. Like they think that the players just aren't going to notice them reducing very real problems down to really nothing more than aesthetics. In fact, she and really all of the female characters in this game, except for one of the antagonists, suffer from the very common DEI writing trope of anything a man can do, a woman can not only do just as well, she can do it outright better than the men can. And this is where I end up having to talk about Gina. Because Gina is your companion throughout the vast majority of the game. You encounter her in Vatican City, and then she accompanies you on the adventure throughout the rest of the game. Now, of course, in concept, this is fine. Indy pretty much always has a companion of some sort accompanying him on his adventures, and that even extends to the games as well. But the way it's handled in Great Circle is really the problem here. You see, most of Gina's character is more or less fine. She's a journalist, most of her skill set is centered around things that you would kind of expect for an investigative journalist who is not afraid of getting their hands a bit dirty with the actual investigation part, so things like being able to pick locks and stuff like that. And so as a baseline character, she's fine. It's just that the further you get into the game, the more you feel like they wanted to make Gina the main character, but they were stymied by the fact that it's an Indiana Jones game, and somebody probably kept telling them, no, you're not supposed to make Gina the main character of the Indiana Jones game. You see, when it comes to solving puzzles and getting the history parts down, Indy can do all of that, but half the time he's just kind of bumbling his way around, and it's Gina who ends up having to steer him in the right direction, or she's the one who has the connections that allow the plot to move forward, or she simply becomes Indy's motivation to move the plot forward. It's the kind of thing where if it happens, say, once or twice, you don't really think too much of it, but it happens enough in this game that it starts to make your brain itch. It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't make sense for an Indiana Jones game. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize they pulled this kind of thing with all of the female characters in this. The game spends an awful lot of time trying to build up these strong, independent, empowered women, and Indy just ends up being in the background while all of this is happening, and more often than not just ends up getting used for comic relief rather than, you know, being the main character of the game that has his name on the title. It's just downright bizarre, and even weirder is the attempt they made at turning Gina into a love interest. It's, well, there's just not really any other way to put it than awkward. It's written and performed in a will they, won't they manner that just doesn't fit with Indiana Jones. Romance in Indiana Jones has always been rather straightforward, and whenever Indy and the love interest have been into each other, they've just gone for it. And that's not what happens in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. The romance subplot goes absolutely nowhere. It's just them kind of pining for each other a bit, and they never act on it. They never really say anything to each other. They just let it go. It's very weird, it doesn't make any sense for Indiana Jones, and, well, it just further makes the game not feel right. And I think that's the best way to sum up the writing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. It just never feels right. It never feels like a proper Indiana Jones game. It feels like some other action-adventure game franchise that was inspired by Indiana Jones, but was written by people who are thoroughly infected with modern day, and can't get that out of their heads enough to make it feel like a proper Indiana Jones adventure. Don't get me wrong, there are times when it comes a bit close to it, but they're moments in the larger whole of the game rather than the entire experience. It's very odd to try to go through this thing if you're a fan of the Indiana Jones franchise, because you'll be sitting there and trying to get into things like whipping and fisticuffs and the shooting mechanics and trying to feel like you're in this proper world-spanning adventure, and you just keep getting pulled out of it every so often and going, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't feel like Indiana Jones. Why is Indy the background character in his own game now? It doesn't make any sense. And with Indiana Jones' look, feel, and sound being such a major component of the game, that's actually a pretty severe detriment to it. And when you start looking at the gameplay, things don't really improve all that much. You see, when you take a glance at this game, it seems to have all of the right elements. I mean, it's got puzzle solving, it's got combat, it's got historical collectibles, it's got a lot of finer details that make it obvious that at very least someone put a lot of effort into the game. But when you bring everything together as a whole, it doesn't quite work. And it's because of a few very specific things. The first of them is that almost all of the puzzles in this game are ridiculously easy to solve because they made this game for the modern audience as far as they're concerned, and they think the modern audience are a bunch of morons who have to be told how to do everything right from the get-go. This means that you never really have to expend much brain power to solve any of the puzzles in the game, and as a result, none of them are really all that interesting, and they're certainly not memorable. I can barely remember any given puzzle in this game, and even the puzzles I do remember were more just annoying rather than difficult. And by annoying, I mean it was easy to find the numbers that it wanted me to find, but because of the way that the puzzle was worded, I could have put those numbers in a couple of different combinations and that could have still worked. It just wanted one very specific combination, so it took me a few tries to get the exact combination that it wanted. That's the kind of annoying we're talking about here. Nothing especially difficult, just a bit tedious. And since you will be doing a lot of puzzle solving in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, that does wear on you after a while. This is compounded by the fact that aside from puzzle solving, the only other things you're able to do are combat and stealth, both of which have their own problems on top of one truly catastrophic problem. And with those, we'll go ahead and start with combat. There's two ways of fighting enemies. You have your hand-to-hand combat, which I will also include the whip in, as well as, of course, any melee weapons. And there's also ranged combat in the form of the various guns you can use. The hand-to-hand combat consists of each fist being a different attack button. So you have left and right fist. If you tap them, it does a quick punch. If you hold it down, it charges up a power punch. And then, aside from that, you have the ability to shove enemies with a different button, as well as, of course, block. And if you time your block correctly, then you will parry an attack and then be able to follow up with an immediate counterattack. And there's also the ability to dodge. The idea is that you will combine light and heavy attacks, you'll do parries and that sort of thing, to ultimately overcome your foes in hand-to-hand combat. Ostensibly, this would open things up for more complex combos and exchanges with enemies, but the reality is you just wait for an enemy to throw a punch at you, you parry it because the timing window is pretty generous for that and it's very easy to score a parry, and then you follow that up with a counterattack and just keep spamming the light attacks until eventually the enemy falls over. And this is the case regardless of what enemy type you're fighting, whether it's the big bruiser type enemies or the more nimble guys, or even a boss fight. It's all going to be the same kind of thing. You just wait for the attack to come in, you parry it, you counterattack, and you just keep spamming light attacks until eventually you're done. Now, they do try to limit this by implementing a stamina mechanic, so whenever you either block an attack or throw a punch, it does drain stamina. So occasionally you'll need to stop throwing punches or trying to parry in order to let your stamina build back up. But all that actually ends up doing is just slowing down what is otherwise very easy combat. And I'm sure that some of you will probably say something like, well, if the gameplay is too easy, then bump up the difficulty. The problem is, that doesn't fix the main thing that makes the combat so easy, which is how incredibly stupid the enemies are. Remember how I said the enemies that you're fighting are portrayed in this game as if they're more bumbling idiots than a real force of evil? The incredibly dumb enemy AI is a major component of that. I mean, hell, if you're paying attention to the video, you've seen the gameplay footage, you've seen exactly how stupid they are, but in case you need a description of just how dumb they are, they'll basically just wander up to you almost single file most of the time, and take turns trying to swing at you, making it incredibly easy to block or parry their attacks. And as long as you're not using a firearm yourself, generally speaking, even the ones who do actually have firearms equipped won't use them against you. They'll just go up to you and start trying to punch you instead. Which is ridiculous considering that enemies using guns against you is pretty much the only threat they'll ever actually pose to you, especially once you get further into the game and you've unlocked more upgrades for Indy so that he has more health, more stamina, etc. I mean, sure, early on in the game, you don't really have the stamina to get into protracted fights, but it's so easy to herd enemies into choke points and then just dispatch them all one at a time that it's basically a joke. And as for the gunplay and how much of a threat the guns pose to the player, well, yeah, they'll do a whole bunch of damage against you, so you do need to pay attention to when enemies are going at you with guns. But the same is not necessarily true for when you're using guns against the enemies. It's really weird how this works. You see, you have disguises that you can wear as part of the stealth system, and some of these come with firearms. Namely, Indy's regular outfit has his typical revolver, whereas if he is dressing up as, say, a German officer, then he gets a Luger, and if he's dressing up as an Italian soldier, then he gets a Beretta 1934. But you can only use these firearms while you have that disguise equipped, so you can't just, say, unlock the German uniform that comes with a Luger and be able to use the Luger while wandering around with Indy's outfit. You only get the one weapon per outfit. And these weapons that are associated with the outfits are the only ones that can be repaired and the only ones that can be reloaded. You see, when it comes to melee combat, each weapon has a durability rating so that as you continue to strike enemies with it, it will lower the durability until eventually the durability empties and the weapon breaks, and then you'll have to either find a new weapon or just go right back to fisticuffs. And the same is true for the pistols that you get as part of these disguises. When you run out of ammunition with them, or if you so choose, you flip them around and just start pistol whipping enemies instead, and if you do that enough, then the weapon's durability will bottom out and it will break, and if you want to use it again, you'll have to use a repair kit on it. But of course, this is only if you flip it around and start pistol whipping enemies with it. If you're just running around shooting enemies, it expends your ammunition, but doesn't degrade its durability. The thing is, you have an extremely limited amount of ammunition that you can carry for these sidearms, and there's an extremely limited amount of ammunition pickups in the various areas that you'll be wandering around. Which probably sounds fine until I tell you that enemies respawn, so you can expend ammunition and eventually just completely run out of it. This isn't as much of a problem as you might think, though, because enemies with firearms also respawn, and they respawn with firearms, so if you take one of them down, then you can pick up their gun and start using it. The thing is that whenever you pick up an enemy weapon, whether it's a rifle, shotgun, submachine gun, or pistol, you're only going to have whatever ammunition is left in the magazine whenever you pick it up, and then once you run out of rounds, you can't reload that weapon. You have to switch over to bashing enemies upside the head with it, or throwing it at enemies to distract them and do some damage, and then go find some other gun to start using instead. This in itself isn't necessarily a huge issue. The idea is to steer you more towards using stealth and using the melee combat because your fists never run out of ammo, obviously. But unfortunately, ammo isn't the only limiting factor. The guns just feel absolutely terrible to use in this game. Enemies can take a, frankly, ludicrous amount of damage before going down. You can shoot an enemy right in the face with a Kar 98K, which is a 7.92 by 57mm Mauser round. And they will basically just say, ow, and keep coming at you. To give you an idea of just how utterly ridiculous this idea is, 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, also known as 8mm Mauser, is a remarkably powerful round, one that a lot of experienced hunters will actually be pretty comfortable taking down bears with. And I don't know if you've ever actually seen a bear, but they're freaking huge and incredibly dangerous. You want something that can take them down in one shot. 8mm Mauser is very capable of doing that. In fact, it is considered downright overpowered for use against humans, and yet, enemies in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle can take multiple rounds of that, even to the face, and be fine. It is just downright ridiculous. In fact, it's so ridiculous, it actually overshadows the fact that the Kar 98, for some baffling reason, has 6 rounds in the magazine that is only capable of actually holding 5 in reality. I think they only did that because the other bolt-action rifle in the game is a Carcano, and that thing holds 6 rounds in reality and in the game, so they wanted them to both feel more or less the same. But funnily enough, the Carcano feels even weaker than the Kar 98, and when you look at the rest of the weapon lineup, it's just wildly all over the place. I mean, on the one hand, it's nice that the developers put effort into making sure the weapon selection was not wildly anachronistic like you tend to see from the movies, where you see German soldiers running around with MP40s in the mid-1930s, because clearly that makes sense. Here, the only significantly anachronistic weapon is the Dishka used during a turret sequence fairly late into the game, but even that is fairly brief. And let's face it, an aircraft-mounted machine gun isn't the kind of thing that most people are going to be able to easily identify. But even that doesn't feel good to use, and that's supposed to be a 50 caliber machine gun. Every single firearm in this game just feels wildly off. Like I said, all the enemies are capable of taking way too many shots, and yet Indy's revolver seems to be the only one that's actually capable of putting them down in a relatively reasonable number of shots, usually about 2 to 3. Of course, this comes at the cost of having a very limited ammo supply and having to reload every single round individually. Meanwhile, you can blast a full load of 12-gauge buckshot right into a Nazi's face and he just shrugs it off like it's nothing. Same with the 8mm Mauser rounds. You can put half a magazine of submachine gun ammo into an enemy and they still won't go down. It just is utterly ridiculous, especially for a company that is most well known for the Wolfenstein reboots. So New Order, Old Blood, and unfortunately New Colossus and Young Blood. The first 3 of which, for all of their failings, at least had some pretty solid gunplay to them. I know that gunplay is not the main focus of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. They wanted to emphasize the melee aspects, the brawling part of it, because Indy definitely gets into way more fistfights in the movies than he does gunfights. But when you end up in situations where it feels like a rake is going to do more damage than a frickin' shotgun blast to the face, you have done something catastrophically wrong. Which of course leads me to the final aspect of gameplay that you can engage with, which is the stealth. Now, stealth in this game is quite simple. Are you crouched? If so, congratulations, you're in stealth mode. Your options for remaining stealthy are now as follows. First, stay out of enemies' line of sight. And in order to direct an enemy's attention away from where you need to go, you can pick up an object and chuck it in the direction you want them to look instead. I hope you weren't really expecting anything more complicated than that, because that is all that the mainstream gaming industry seems to think that the average person is capable of handling. Extremely simplistic, incredibly easy because of how stupid the enemies are, and ultimately quite boring, but it does make things move slightly more quickly than if you end up getting in a fist fight with an entire camp. The only aspect of the stealth that differentiates it from pretty much every other modern AAA stealth system out there is that it does have the disguises, of which you'll have 2 per area that you're exploring, and those will let you walk around in certain restricted areas without being immediately attacked. But if you get into an officer's line of sight, then their suspicion meter will start rising, and eventually they will raise an alarm because they can see through your disguise. And to make matters more frustrating in this regard, you don't get access to the disguises that will actually let you move among the enemies without being attacked immediately until very late into the areas that you're exploring, so you really don't get much use out of them anyway. The only major benefit you really get from them are the weapons that come with them, as well as the keys that come with these disguises that will allow you to access certain locked areas that you can't get in otherwise. And that is almost the entirety of what you will be doing throughout Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. You will be fighting enemies, or sneaking around them, or you will be solving puzzles. And while all of the mechanics at least check the boxes of, yeah, that definitely makes sense for an Indiana Jones game, the actual implementation of those mechanics is quite weak. They did try to add some level of progression to it, with the sense that you can unlock abilities as the game goes on. You'll get these various skill books that you can then spend your adventure points that you earn from just playing the game normally and solving puzzles and stuff like that, to buy these upgrades that will give you things like extra health bars, or consolidate smaller health bars into larger ones, or give you more stamina, or make you do more damage with your fists, or more damage with your picked up melee weapons, or more damage with pistols, or things like that. But none of these upgrades are really all that interesting, not even ones that give you new moves, like the upgrades that will allow you to do things like pull enemies in with the whip and then knock them out. Hell, I only managed to get that to work once in the entire game. Every other time I tried to do it, it would pull enemies towards me, but it wouldn't trigger the knockout command. That was just really annoying, and honestly, the whip is so underutilized in combat that I just didn't use it most of the time. You can use it to scare dogs away because the whip crack makes them run away, and you can use it to whip weapons out of enemies' hands, but it does basically no damage, and frankly, you're just better served by either picking up some sort of melee weapon and then bonking enemies over the head with a stealth takedown, or just picking up some sort of melee weapon and bonking an enemy over the head repeatedly until they fall over. And that, of course, leads me to another thing that's really weird about the upgrade system. One of the upgrades is the ability to do stealth takedowns without the use of melee weapons. You see, up until you get that upgrade, you have to have an equipped melee weapon of some sort, regardless of what it is, to perform a stealth takedown. Why? Honestly, I have no idea. The improvised melee weapons you can pick up in the game are plentiful. They're everywhere, so it's not like you're ever going to have a shortage of them, and it can be anything from glass bottles to scrub brushes to anything, really. So you can just pick up a plethora of items, bonk enemies over the head with them, and be done with it. And all this mechanic has achieved is mild inconvenience at absolute best. Of course, getting the amount of adventure points you need to get all these upgrades anyway is a bit of a hassle, because not only do you have to progress the game normally, solve puzzles, fight enemies, all that sort of thing, but you basically have to go out of your way to snap photos of everything that you can snap photos of, as well as solve all the extra puzzles and get all the collectible items that serve no real gameplay function. They're just there. And that all gets pretty tedious. You end up with the whole modern game collectathon problem that's really just there to pad out the length of the game more than anything else. And the more you play Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the weaker it gets. It starts out and it's at least somewhat interesting, but the further you get in, the more the tedium of the gameplay mechanics really sets in, the less interesting the story gets, because it's just treading water most of the time, and it feels like it really didn't want to be a video game in the first place, but rather a movie or a mini-series or something like that, especially considering that all of the cutscenes in the game are completely unskippable, and the entire experience just suffers as a result. And to top it all off, there's just a general level of jank and clunkiness that the game suffers from, and it's never really something you can completely overcome. I mentioned earlier that the controls were a bit of a problem, particularly with the leaning commands, and that is because the leaning commands don't actually work unless you specifically engage a leaning mode, and you can't do anything while you're in the leaning mode. At least that's how it ends up working on PC, because it was designed for gamepad controls, and on a gamepad you can just hold down, I think it's one of the triggers, and you can then move left or right with either the left or right stick, I can't remember which, and that will actually have you lean left or right. So it's more intuitive to do that with a gamepad, and they just didn't even think about how to properly implement it with keyboard and mouse controls, so it just ends up being awkward no matter what. And then, of course, there's the awkwardness of inventory management and actually trying to use items. You see, you have a wide variety of items you can use, from things like, of course, your weapons, to tools like the lighter or the rebreather, or the 3 restorative item types that you have access to, which are bandages that replenish your health, bread items which will give you bonus health, and fruit items that will give you bonus stamina. And to use any of these items, you have to find it in your inventory, pull it out, and then actually use it. And as you've no doubt seen from the gameplay footage, that can get fairly clumsy at times. You'll be just fumbling around in your inventory trying to cycle between these things, because you can't simply select one button to pull out exactly what you need. You have to cycle through them with the inventory slots instead. Or if it's not an item that is in one of the direct quick access slots, then you have to open the satchel and then navigate to it using the grid interface. Then you can select it and then pull it out and start using it with whatever you need to do. And this goes for keys as well. If you want to unlock a door, you have to go up to the door that you presumably have the key for, and if you have a key for the door, it will give you an interface prompt showing you that you have the key for it, so you just press a button, and then he pulls out the key, and then you can stick the key in the door using the action button, but Indy doesn't actually turn it, because guess what? To open doors, or unlock things, or pull levers, or really do pretty much anything in this game, you have to press the action button to interact with the thing, and then use movement controls to actually do the thing you want to do with it. It's the same kind of problem that the original Gothic had, where you would say, go up to a treasure chest, and instead of opening it by pressing the action button, you would press the action button and absolutely nothing would happen. Instead, you had to hold the action button and then press forward to actually do whatever you actually wanted to do. It's the kind of thing you will see some idiots out there saying is immersive, but the reality is that it's just tedious, clunky, and annoying, and funnily enough, not only has it not gotten any less tedious, clunky, and annoying in the ensuing 24 years since the original Gothic's release, but it's actually even worse in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, because they break down actions even more than simply hold the action button and press forward. Think about it this way. To open a locked door in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, you press the action button to pull out the key. You press the action button again to insert the key. And then you use movement controls to turn the key and open the door. You are taking something that should have been one button press and turning it into at minimum 3 button presses. This is not immersive, it's just stupid. I've seen a few people saying that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is more like Indiana Jones and the Mid-Circle, but even that isn't really true. It is an outright weak game. It's not the worst game you'll ever play or anything like that, but it is the kind of thing that absolutely nobody in their right mind should ever pay full price for, and frankly, even just buying the game at all feels like a complete waste. I played through this thing using Game Pass, meaning that I didn't buy the game outright. I just have my Game Pass subscription and played it as part of that, and it feels like fodder that was made specifically for the Game Pass model. The kind of thing that back when video rental stores were still a thing, we would say was just a cheap throwaway rental at absolute best. The kind of thing that isn't bad enough that it's outright irritating to play, but it's also not good enough to really be all that interesting and stay with you. So you play through it once on a weekend rental, you return it to the shop, and then frankly you just never think about it ever again. And funnily enough, that is exactly how the discourse has gone with Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. The game launched, it had a whole bunch of hype right around the release, and then absolutely nothing after about a week or so. It was like it just dropped off the face of the earth entirely, and when you look at how the game actually is, it is abundantly clear why. Ultimately, I give Indiana Jones and the Great Circle a 2 out of 5. Again, it is not the worst game you will ever play. In the grand scheme of Indiana Jones games, it's not even remotely the worst one. But it is plagued with a lot of the same problems that plague other modern titles, and like those other modern titles plagued by the same problems, it's just not worth your time or money. I know there will probably be some naysayers in the comments saying things like, well, it's on Game Pass, so you might as well try it if you happen to have Game Pass, and honestly, no, you shouldn't. It may not necessarily be a bad enough game that I would say absolutely never play it at all, but there's just so many other options out there that are so much better than this that there's no reason to play Indiana Jones and the Great Circle over those other games unless you're just such a die-hard Indiana Jones fan that you have to experience every single piece of Indiana Jones media. And even for those people, this game is still probably going to wear on them after a while, and they're going to come out of it feeling that it was really just not worth the time and effort after all. Thank you all very much for watching, and thank you all very much for bearing with me on how long this video took to come out. I originally planned on making this video back in December, and it just didn't happen. I ended up having a really obnoxious mental block with it, and I didn't overcome that until pretty recently. And for those of you who might be wondering, well, what's going on with the request month content, still working on catching up on all of that. But since I was running into some problems with Sniper Elite, I decided to go ahead and get this done since I had already finished the game and the video was already in mid-production when I hit that mental block, so I just had to get past that mental block and get the rest of the audio recorded, get the editing done, and get the video finished up. So Again, thank you all very much for bearing with me there. As for the rest of the requests month, or really now request season content, I guess, Q&A is in production. It's going to take a while to get done, so just bear with me on that. And I'm just kind of chipping away at it question by question and clip by clip and such over the ensuing however long it takes until I get that done. I'm hoping to get the Sniper Elite video done next week. I hit some snags with that from the actual game itself, not from any kind of mental blocks or anything. But I'm hoping to get that done by the end of next week. And then it's on to catching up on a few of the other projects that I've mentioned, like doing the Thief series, as well as Avowed. In fact, Avowed will probably come out before the Thief series, because those are slow, methodical games, and I want to go ahead and take my time with those. So stay tuned for all of that. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all again for watching. If you like the videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Of course, if you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine. I understand. It's just the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thank you all again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.